Okay, we should start. So the plan for today is that we're going to take a little bit of midway evaluation, even if we're not midway anymore. But I'm going to take that, as I wrote in an email, as an excuse to talk a bit about what your expectations and worries about the exam are. And then we will pick up where we are after 3 guest lectures. And we will see an extra example of how we can use these tools that we have learned throughout the course to actually understand something about at least a scientific research problem. That's how did humans evolve symbolic behavior. In terms of the evaluation, so I've been told, this is something that I haven't done before, but I've been told that you've been exposed to a way in which teachers show you some questions and then leave the room for 10, 15 minutes. You discuss it and write the key points on the blackboard. Is that something that's true? Because I've been told, oh, that's the way to go. Okay, well, we'll try it and then we'll see how it goes. And there's 2 key points that I want you to discuss. And one is the traditional course evaluation, right? How has the course worked for you so far? What should be kept as is? Are there things you'd like to change? And this part is, in a sense, good for me to evaluate the course, but not really good for changing the course of the course, because from now on, we're actually going to focus on exam supervision. And also, I'm not really sure that I will have the course again. So that's also why it's sort of slided a bit late in the course. The second point is, what are your shared worries about the exam paper? Are there shared questions not specific to a single project that you'd like to ask? Are there shared aspects that you'd like us to explicitly support you with during the following weeks? And I think this is something that's much more operationable for the next few weeks. There's a couple of points. I'm fully aware that 3 weeks of guest lectures in a row is not ideal. I apologize for that. That was the condition at which I could take up this course because I had previous commitments. Things happened a bit too fast just before the start of the course. And then, oh, I didn't write it down. The second one is that the evaluation will happen with Arnaud, who was the responsible for the course before I got given that, and that external censor. But I'll be talking with Arnaud throughout the next few weeks on a regular basis so that we have expectations fully online, right? Good. So I'm going to give you, let's say, 15 minutes to take these in the class, and then I'll come back so that you will feel freer to express the different points. In particular, like, you should say everything that you want, but give me and Christiane some good points on how to help you better in the next few weeks. So I'll be back at 35. I'll leave that up there so you have everything there. I'm out here, so if you need something, you can just come and yell. Okay, see you in 15 minutes. Coming back. Okay. So here are the answers. So point one, general structure as an inspirational subject only works with this exam format. We like to be taught the doing. Okay, good. So I'm reading this as in this specific course, there were a lot of topics, but you didn't get too much time to sit and work in depth with any of these. Yes. Which I think is a fair point. There's something about these being your last big content course and trying to cover a bunch of different topics. But I fully agree. So one of my plans last time I taught the course was to actually try 1 year doing in depth the agent-based modeling way so that people actually would spend time with one topic or at least having one method that is the red thread throughout the course. But I think this is a very fair point. On the other hand, the good thing is that you get to really work on basically any topic that you want to try out for the bachelor thesis. But I think it's a fair point. Yes. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yep. No, but I think so. There's also a few things that can be adjusted to make maybe, for instance, working on networks not just a 1 week off, but something that comes through 2 or 3 weeks. There's something about missing the red thread, which is this related with the guest lecture that tended to be a bit less consistent or more in general? More in general. Okay. I think that that's again another fair point. I have a few slides reiterating the way I see the red thread, but I fully agree that that might be idiosyncratic. Yes. Guest lectures are nice. So yes, they work nicely. I think I would rather have interleave them a bit more so I could contextualize them, but I try to pick people who would be good at giving the guest lectures. Yes. And then there's more methods for exams. So now we formally introduced as new methods only networks and agent-based models. We tried to do it a bit hands-on this year with agent-based model that recurred, at least through a few different practical exercises. Again, it's the trade-off between content and methods, right? Where this is a course that tends to sit a bit on a difficult trade-off between the two. But I think that's definitely something that if I get this course again, I will work on. Do you have suggestions on things that you think would be cool as methods to try out? Yes. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Not in this course, no. That wasn't an original topic in the course. I think it's something that Arnaud introduced last year. But I fully get the point that introducing NLP proper in the master, it's too late. Yes. I think that that's something that we can take at a more structural level than just within this course, right? Doing something in this course could be part of the solution, but I think we need to think it in a broader perspective. Yes. 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 Okay, yeah, I think that's another good point. That's probably because we moved a lot of the math of that in decision making in the master. One way in which an exam paper working on game theory would B is by using the game theoretical paradigms. So, for instance, the dictator game or the prisoner's dilemma. So, making an experiment that's shaped by those formalizations of social interactions in order to explore, I don't know, what increments the willingness to cooperate. Or if you have two people that are diverse compared to people that are very similar discussing how to best solve this game, who gets to the optimal solution more often. But I think that's another good point. Let me actually make a couple of notes. Of course, I get when I open my notes, there's the stuff that my kids have been writing on that. Okay, yes. Good. Okay, so there's the red thread. I'll take it up again in one of the slides, but I think these are all very fair points. Point two. So we have the exam coming up. We'll be dedicating the next 3 weeks to exam supervision and exam exercises. And this is very useful for me and Christiane to sort of get what are your current worries. So the first one is, how should the exam paper be structured? And the traditional structure is what you've been doing in cognition and communication. You did also perception and action to a certain extent, just not running the experiment, right? Yeah. You also ran the experiment. Okay, good. But it's the traditional scientific article template where you have an introduction that has to do a really good job making the censor think that this is a good question, right? And giving the censor a sense that you have read relevant literature that can motivate the very specific research questions, the approach that you have in the methods, right? And the discussion, right? So that it enables you to take what we know already, use it to design the experiment so that you get some findings that no matter what allow you to say something more than what was in the introduction. There is a very good trick in my head at least and in the evaluations that I went through with sensors that's trying to be very explicit in how you weave the red thread through these different points. For instance, a cheap but very effective trick is to say, I have 3 research questions. I give them a number, call it RQ1, RQ2, RQ3. I advance if there are hypotheses, and I call them with those specific, so H1, H2, and H3. As I write the methods, I very explicitly refer to those by saying, in order to test H1, this is the kind of model I'm running. In order to test H2, I might be using the same model, but I'm running this specific contrast, right? Or I'm running it on these different data sets, or I'm running this different model. And then in the results, you might want to have plots that very clearly refer to 1 and 2 and 3, because that makes for a much easier read for a sensor who has a heap of, hopefully it's not going to be just one sensor, but let's say 30 different elaborates to be read in a few days, right? You want to pre-chew your argument for the sensor. And references of that kind, very explicit, make the job much easier. Sometimes it happens that you might want to obfuscate a bit more because things did not come up as clear as you hoped, as not thought through as you hoped because time ran or you had another exam or life happened. And then you might try to be a bit more implicit and write well so that things go through. But generally, it's a good strategy to sort of really pre-chew it, right? Are there more questions on this? Okay, so the second one is how to analyze ABMs. So let's say that we're interested in a specific problem. I'm not going to mention, I had a few emails on that. Now those examples come to mind. But let's say that we make an ABM on, I don't know, what happens. Actually, I had a few years ago, what happens if you put uh, if you change the structure of the traffic in these or that way, or what happens if you implement different ghetto policies on the way that population moves, different kinds of population moves within the territory of Aarhus. You run your simulation 1,000 times in condition 1, 1,000 times in condition 2, and now you want to make sense of that, right? And the starting point is often, very often, almost always a plot where you're contrasting these two conditions according to whatever is relevant. And then the question comes, should I be able or not to say whether this is statistically significant, reliable, credible, pick your death, right? And one of the counter argument for doing that is to say what is statistically significant has nothing to do with the size of the effects. It has something to do, actually, to a certain extent, not even that much with how variable the results of your simulations are, but it has something to do with how many times you're running the simulation. So no matter how small and varying the effect is, if you run enough simulations, your standard error is going to shrink and shrink and shrink so that you can always get a significant result. So Paul Smaldino, in his great book on modeling social phenomena or something like that, makes a good case that there's no point in doing statistics. Some sensors have not, drank the Kool-Aid. So sometimes papers actually run a model. And I'll be talking to Arnaud about that. But when I'm evaluating exams, I don't care about which of the two approaches. You don't get penalized for the one or the other, as long as you're very clear in discussing how variable the simulations are, how different the average is between the two conditions, and what the practical implications of that could be for the problem you're trying to tackle, right? No, I'm actually going to make sure whether no that you shouldn't be penalized if you run statistics or if you don't run statistics. I'm actually going to write it now. And if Arnaud very strongly disagrees, we'll have to fight it at boxing or something. But no, I'll let you know if he has a very strong opinion in one of the two fields. But I taught him this course, so I suspect that he will agree. Yes. So, do we have the same degree of freedom regarding topic for exam as previous courses? Is SocKult an umbrella where almost everything can fit? And as these element here points to, the answer is yes, for two reasons. One is that everything basically has a social and cultural aspects and or uses methods that we discussed. Number two, these very way of building your education where every semester or almost every semester you have a course where you pick your own topic and you build up your exam paper is a way of sort of preparing you for project work, but within the education is a way for preparing you for bachelor thesis. And so this is really an arena where you can try things out. Arnaud is even more scatterbrained than I am, so that's also not going to be an issue with that. And I say that with love. Right? So, of course, right, it happened a few times that we had exams where somebody was writing about, I don't know, running these specific questionnaires on eating disorder. And there was not a single reference that entered in the exam or in the course syllabus. And we hadn't discussed that topic in advance with the student. And that feels very much reusing an exam paper from somewhere else, right? So make sure that you use me and Christiane to discuss the topics. You're really free to pick methods and topics. It's rhetorically useful to use some of the references for the course, but not necessary at all. It's a really, really good idea to discuss your topic via email at the supervision in some fashion with me and or Christiane. So recommended metrics, what to stay away from, NLP, ABM, etc. So in terms of which methods to stay away from, the only thing that I tend to recommend to stay away from is very large empirical projects. Rather run a pilot with a limited, like only one or two or a couple of the conditions or a limited set of participants. Don't be relying on collecting a lot of empirical data unless you're sure you can make it. In terms of ABMs or NLPs or network theory or experimental stuff, there's no no-go area in principles. Again, this is really vague because we're not discussing a specific topic. Use me and Christiane to discuss the specific topic. I'm not sure I understand which metrics, what that means. Yes. Okay. So what is theoretical and exploratory? Oh, could you write a theoretical and or exploratory paper, a kind of a proof of concept? And I sort of given the answer here in the sense that there's a very wide range of papers that don't rely on empirical data and a very wide range of papers that don't rely on very well-defined hypotheses in advance that can make for perfectly good, very highly graded papers. There are a few guidelines that we can discuss. So for instance, let's say that you say, oh, I really found the Schelling model very cool. Can I write a paper just exploring that model? Right. And then the general answer is yes, but if you want to have a good grade, you want to make very clear what's the point of the paper, right? So for instance, oh, I want to take Schelling's model and I want to go through that and show how in a bunch of situations, its predictions are very weird, right? Or I want to show how varying different policies internal to the model that is, for instance, you can give people a memory, agents a memory. I want to see how that changes the way that the model works because people have a memory. It's very important to see which kind of effects that are, right? That is a very good paper. That is an easy pass. It could go, all the way up to 12. But it has a new point that's exploring. It's not just I'm taking a model and I'm just rewriting it, right? You want to sort of give it your own twist. And again, part of that is really rhetorics, right? Is really communication. Is really because you learn a lot by re-implementing a model. You learn a lot by exploring and visualizing, but you want to bring the sensor with you in this discovery journey, right? Make the sensor really see that there is a point, a question, a doubt to be clarified through the work that you're doing through the paper. A second aspect of that is to say, well, so another kind of theoretical model is simply saying, oh, there's this interesting problem. Now I'm going to build some very simplified mathematical model and run an ABM or simply a simulation from that and see what the implications of the model are. That's also very good, right? You're saying there is this model, this phenomenon, we want to understand it. Here is how we can start doing that. When we move into proof of concept, as I was saying, it's absolutely, there's so many SocKult papers that became bachelor theses, right? So try to find the minimal core of a larger bachelor projects that you want to do and run it for this, right? So sometimes that implies saying, hey, I'm actually interested in going out and running some questionnaires on the social network of internationals across the university, right? And I have some connections that help me doing that. So what I can do is I can actually design the survey here and run it through a couple of years of CogSci students, right? And that probably will not give me the statistical power to make generalizable claims or even the representativity, but I can be very explicit in saying that this is an interesting problem. And the scope of this paper is to develop the methods to do that, right? It could also be, I think it's a bit more edge case. I've argued successfully with sensors about that. You can even do something of the kind of a register report. You know what register reports are? Not everybody? Or okay. So the idea is sometimes you want to run a study and you want in science, you want the peer review to actually tell you to change your method or your experiment before you actually run the study, because it's kind of ill to go out and run for several months, going to, I don't know, schools around the area and running studies with the kids there. And then you write up the paper and then you submit it and they say, nah, you should have asked this different question, right? So what you can do is you can run a small pilot study and then build up exactly the kind of model that you would need to run the analysis on the real data. And then you can run simulations from that model to see how many participants you would actually need if you want to get results in a certain directions that have an effect size that's at least X, and get statistical reliability more than 80% of the time, right? And so you very explicitly say that these pilot participants are not really to assess any effect per se, but they are there to give you an idea of the heterogeneity in the data between people and to have something on which you can actually build up a meaningful model that then is ready to run whenever you get the full data set. Yes. Are there questions on these things? Are there further points? Okay, I'm gonna anticipate because now we're almost to the break. Wait, I'm actually just gonna go down here. I had a slide on what's gonna happen in the next few weeks so that, yes, we can tie it up with this. So next week, both the lecture and the class and the lecture of the week after are going to be replaced with a bunch of time slots, which I will send, so that each group that works on a paper, not study group, but group that works on a paper, gets 15 minutes with me. I will send you some guiding questions, which you should read to prepare for the meeting. We don't need to stick to those, but that's just because sometimes it's nice to be forced to think about that. I will usually make a a Google Sheet, and then people can sort of sign in the different slots. And if things happen and you really can find a slot in those that fits, you send me an email and we try to figure it out. On May 9th, which is the practical exercise, not this week, but the week after, we will run a practical exercise on writing the abstract of your paper, because it helps like narrowing and focusing and sharpening. Again, divided into 2 classes. On May 16th, which is the last time we have lecture classes, what we're going to do is we're going to organize the What a Great Idea Fair. That is, at that point, Christiane and me will have an idea of the different group projects, and then we will organize each project into groups. Well, we'll divide the class into groups so that the projects in each group have some sort of resonance with each other. And you will have to give to the other projects in your group a short pitch of your project. 4 years ago, what we did is people were recording a video. 3 years ago, even if that was the requisite, half the people thought it was annoying, so they prefer to give a live pitch. So that's really up to you. Then once everybody in the group has given a pitch, we shuffle again, and you have a different group in which you have to do that again. This is a way of helping you to practice your argument and the way it's structured. You don't need to have the results already, but it's good to have what's the line of arguments and to get feedback from your peers. We don't do it in plenum because it gets very quickly boring for people to have to listen to 40 projects, right? So this is people have started writing me emails. So far, it's very bearable. So I tend to answer quite quickly. If I start getting 40 emails a day on that, I'm not able to answer. So you should always feel free to send emails. The other side is that once I get too many emails, I can't follow up on everything. Good. Do you have other questions on the exam stuff? Good. So we'll take 7-minute breaks, and then at 3:10 we'll start the final cultural evolution part. Yeah, no worries. Okay, we're gonna start. And so this is a couple of slides trying to go again through the red thread in the way that I think this course is trying to open up your perspective on cognition. So we've seen in the first lectures that we can conceptualize social cognition as the integration of information from yourself and others, both as a process that happens within individuals, but also as a process that happens in the interaction. So we've seen how we would move from social cognition to teamwork, either in the immediate context of doing things together, but also in the larger context of social activities like scientific development. And we discussed how in these contexts, cognition is deeply shaped by the way in which information can flow. So we were seeing that if you have fully connected network, for instance, information flows freely, which is partly a good thing, but partly a bad thing because it risks everybody conforming to a solution that usually is not optimal. But even if it's not optimal, if it's optimal, it might not be optimal as time changes, as condition changes. And so we covered social networks and network theories as a way of looking at these kind of dynamics. We also saw how information does not just flow horizontally in these networks as shared by peers, but it also flows in vertical ways, meaning that by relying on social information, we can gradually develop and transmit traditions, right? The way we think and do things here. In previous years, students were often interested in seeing how a tradition, for instance, of being very competitive in the classroom in some of the home countries of international students would compare to a tradition of doing a lot of group projects, as lots of the Danish school would do. And these things are not simply a peer culture, but it's something that's shaped by the teachers and all these longer term traditions. And we've discussed, I have a couple of slides more on cultural transmission and cultural evolution, but I just wanted to make the point that while a lot of these topics can be investigated with experiments and observational studies and surveys and other things that you've already covered in other courses, we used ABM and networks as extra method that target some specific aspects of these dynamics and that could add to your toolbox of things that you can use. And so the way that then cultural transmission and these horizontal and vertical dynamics shape how we should think about cognition, right, is that first, right, we cognize, terrible word, we think through specific contents, and the contents that we have available are available due to cultural traditions, right? Namely, education would be one of the key ways in which you get exposed to specific content and not others because of the way that society has been historically shaped. And that allows you to do things that you wouldn't be able to do if you hadn't been exposed. So if you know something about art history or literary culture, like there are certain forms of arts, certain forms of literature, which are only possible and interesting because they're based on something previous. Silly example, Cubism is only interesting because there is a tradition of representational paintings. So the idea is that the human cognitive machinery is unusually, compared to other animals, open to external content, and this content enables building further and further. There's a fantastic, not completely correct, I think, but a really cool book called The Secret of Our Success, which has the first couple of chapters, which are very enlightening by describing a lot of Western civilizations exploring different places, including when the Vikings went to Greenland, and then dying miserably while the natives are thriving very easily on the side, simply because there are certain contents that they received from their vertical culture. For instance, in the Viking attempts at settling Greenland, right, they really couldn't survive the winters because they thought that the different practices of using seal fat to cover yourself and impermeabilize your clothing, of eating fermented meat, were just terrible and immoral, and then they died, right? But there is a much more radical way in which these can be spun, is that not only the content, but the human cognitive machinery itself is shaped by cultural tradition. So certain ways of doing things and thinking are actually taught and encouraged via cultural transmission. There is another book called Cognitive Gadgets, that I mentioned before, where the whole spiel, the whole idea is that humans are not innately propense and good at reading other people's mind, for instance. But what they have is some basic reinforcement learning mechanism and saliency and joint attention mechanism. And then through child rearing practices and caregiver sort of pointing to other people and talking about other people, bootstrapping these ideas of theory of mind and perspective taking, which if the children did not grow in this specific kind of supporting environment, would not develop, right? So you have a general, very good learning machinery with some very basic attention to others. And then through the child rearing practices, you get the full social cognition that we think is typical of humans. I think I'm actually gonna, I think this is something that Elena was talking about 2 weeks ago, but that you have cultural transmission, which is the way in which information is transmitted and communicated. And in a sense, it's often seen through the metaphor of contagion. Think about every time we speak about misinformation, right? You get contaged by these bad ideas. While cultural evolution is the way in which this information is not simply transmitted, but actually changes through transmission. And it changes because it is an evolutionary process. So information cultural traits has variation. Different people have different information. Different communications have different content. And as this content makes a difference, right? It makes you cool amongst other people. It allows you to eat better than other people, et cetera, et cetera. It allows you to, get the tip on buying the new fancy cryptocurrency that then skyrockets and you get rich, right? So certain of these informations is more likely to be passed. And therefore, the distribution of the information in the environment changes. Also, since we have brains, we're not like point-wise agents. As these information passes through humans, it actually gets filtered and abstracted away or consolidated to be more appealing to our brain, right? So what do we remember in a piece of information? What's easier to remember? What are we going to communicate? What's easier to remember because the rest we've forgotten, right? But also information evolves. It can be built upon. And you've seen something last 2 weeks ago in Elena's MATLAB tournament where people can take something that's there and use it as the step for what comes next. And I'm actually giving you this general framework because we're going to be applying it in a second. And actually, I'm going to be skipping this, except this very cool thing that there's observational studies looking at some chimps are putting grass in their ears for no particular reason, right? There's fads that emerge in chimpanzees. There's orcas that start wearing dead salmons in the head, and that makes them more popular. And there's been people studying how these goes up and down with years. Actually, I think there was a lull of about 20 years in a specific place, and now it came back again with wearing the dead salmon on your thing. But I don't want to spend too much time there. Yes. Okay. So where I want to go is that with what we've learned, we can actually tackle a bunch of phenomena that we didn't think we could tackle. And I'm going to be talking a lot about a project that is still running to a certain extent called eSymb, or the evolution of early symbolic behavior here at the department, that tries exactly to use these tools that we discussed to understand key problems like when we go into caves in specific areas around the world. These are examples from the Cantabrian caves in northern Spain, close to the Basque Country. Actually, lots of those are in the Basque countries. We see stuff like amazingly detailed bisons and antelopes and uh, shapes of hands and some really weird squares with lines and dots. Right? And uh, humans, since they've been finding them, have been wondering about what they are. If you look at archaeological papers, you get anything from, oh, those representations are actually symbolic systems to talk about beliefs in gods and blah, 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 or those representations are about telling people coming to these caves when the different animals reproduce so that you can time your hunting practices and so on and so forth. And if these already feels very shaky and difficult to evaluate for something that happened between 25 and 10,000, 25,000 and 10,000 years ago, there's actually much older findings that we really are interested in figuring out what they mean. For instance, 500,000 years ago, somebody, probably a Homo erectus, carved on that shell a zigzag. That's the earliest symbolic behavior that we have a trace of. And if you go to Leiden, where they have the specific specimen, they decided to represent it like this. And if you look at her face, I don't know, I have a very clear idea of what that shell might be used, right? It's clearly a flirting instrument. But well, actually, we don't know anything, right? We have this shell that's 500,000 years old in an area that was populated by Homo erectus, and there is some sort of sign that looks intentional, right? If we go closer to us, between 200,000 and 400,000 years ago, there's been last year a big splash with the Homo naledi. You know about the Homo naledi? Is this hominin species that was found suddenly a few years ago in this cave in South Africa, which looks very simian. So it doesn't look like the traditional hominins that we think. Also, the morphology of the skull is very simian, but there's a bunch of very sensationalistic findings, which we're still evaluating, but one of them says, hey, look, there's these scratches on the wall where we found a bunch of bodies. Homo naledi created art, right? There's also discussion about whether they had burials, whether they were cooking food, and so on and so forth. If we go a bit closer in time, between 400,000 and 100,000 years ago, in South Africa, there's a few sites where we found different kinds of materials. So in Blombos at the bottom, we found ochre stones. So stones, red stones that plausibly were carved to extract powder, a pigment that was used to color people or color clothing or color the wall or something like that. And there are a few of these stones that have accumulated over a period of 40,000 years that actually don't look like having carving for extracting powder, but having carvings that are much more regular than what that practice would suggest. And in Deep Clough, a bit higher up, you have these ostrich shells that were likely used as containers for liquids, where plausibly, in order to avoid them being too slippery, were carved a bit. But over time, we see that these carvings become more and more regular in a way that cannot simply be rasping against them to make them less slippery, period. Right? And in the last 15 to 20 years, there have been a lot of papers in Nature and Science really detailing these kind of findings and making interesting claims. So what we have is that we have incomplete traces of behaviors from the remote past. We want to use them to better understand where humans come from, right? Where our behaviors come from. And what happens in archaeology, and I'm only slightly emphasizing it, is that you have a couple of pages with very rigorous dating of the materials and their surrounding, really trying to get at when they come from and whether they could have been produced by chance. So lots of rigorous analysis of the potential production process. And then once that establishes it's very unlikely to be produced by chance, the last paragraph of the paper, it says, see an engraving, it's a clear sign that the producers had a language, or they had recently undergone evolutionary processes which changed their brain anatomy, because if you don't have those engravings before, but you have them after, something has to have changed in the brain, right? We can use this material trace to say something about the brain. Isn't that cool? Or that there were sacred rituals in the caves or systems to remember where animals procreate, etc. And this is to a cognitive scientist, the very dissatisfying part, where maybe we can actually say something. So can we do better? And this is where there was a project that we started a few years ago. It was led by Christian Tulane. And what we did is, skip this, we first reviewed what people were saying in these archaeological papers on the potential function of these engravings. So for instance, we have Derek Hudson at University of York that is kind of a brain reductionist, but has some good points, where he says that these engravings seem to be exactly the kind of patterns that make different parts of our visual cortex fire up. So the crossing of the lines, the parallel lines, the squares, that points to a basic hypothesis that these are just things that look nice to our brains, right? Therefore, the engravings are decorations. They don't necessarily have a meaning beyond the fact that they look nice, right? If I scratch the ochre and suddenly I know that two lines are crossing and it's kind of nice, I might make it again, right? Because it looks nice, right? And I guess winter evenings are long and boring. Another group led by Pierre-Jean Texier says, well, actually, no. What we see is that the engravings that we see in Diepkloof and the engravings that we see in Blombos, they're not the same kind of engravings. So maybe these are ways of signaling group identity. This is the way that we do things here, right? We produce these ostrich shells and we carve them in a specific way that identifies the way we do things. And finally, you have Christopher Hanchelwood at the University of Bergen, who just goes full on and says, these motives suggest arbitrary conventions unrelated to reality-based cognition, as in the case of the Upper Paleolithic, and they may have been constructed with symbolic intent, the meaning of which is now unknown. This find demonstrates that ochre use in this specific area was not exclusively utilitarian, not just to extract the powder, but arguably the transmission and sharing of the meaning of the engravings relied on fully syntactical language. Right? So we have three main hypotheses. They have an aesthetic meaning, right? They look pleasant, or they used implicitly or explicitly as connotations of how we do things here, of the group identity, or they're actually denotational language. They have specific meaning so that one engravings means something very different from the other. And they might rely on language. So the operations that these scholars are doing is they're minimize this, taking a specific symbolic form, and they're inferring the way that they were used and their internal meaning. What we tried to do was actually to make this a bit more complex. We still start from the symbolic form, but the symbolic form, which can be described with a bunch of features, they actually have cognitive affordances, right? So think about the idea of Derek Hudson. These patterns might do something to our brain, might be pleasant to look at, might be easy to remember, right? Might be easy to discriminate so that we can use them to denote one object or another. And it is through these cognitive affordances that we can reconstruct the way they might have been used. So the idea is that these artifacts, right, were used for something. And as the hominins, our ancestors, were using them over a period of, in the case of the Blombos and Diepkloof engravings, about 40,000 to 60,000 years, they might have evolved to fulfill that function better, right? So if they're used for aesthetic purposes, initially, right, people might have just made crosses and things, but as they realize that it looks even better if you have two crosses, one on the side of the other, or that everything is parallel, right? Over time, these engravings will show more and more of those properties. If they're used for denotational purposes, right, we have that these engravings will become easier and easier to discriminate the one from the other. But we'll see that in a second. So by measuring the cognitive implications of these engravings and how they change over time, we might actually better inform the inferences about how they were used. So what we did is we went back to the records and we identified which of these engravings were actually present and their temporal sequence as much as it was possible to reconstruct. So here we see a selection of the ones that were engraved on ochre on top, and below a selection of those that were engraved on ostrich shells. And the idea is that we want to see whether they have the same kind of evolution as we see, for instance, in percussion tools, like a hammer, that over several thousand of years, we see evolving towards something that's better and better at hammering. Right? So I've already done this, right? We want to see aesthetic displays, cultural connotation, and full-blown denotational symbolic signs. What we do then is we take those, we extract the patterns that are there, and then since we're experimentalist, right, we want to control for things like the complexity, the number of lines, and so on and so forth. And therefore, we isolate the patterns that can be reproduced with 6 lines. Then we take the first hypothesis and we say that if these patterns are used to endure or as aesthetic displays, they should become more salient to the human eye, easier to see, increasingly recognized as intentional. So we test the saliency with something that's called continuous flash suppression with an A and not an E. You know these paradigms, right? So you're looking at a screen through a device that splits the area of sight of your 2 eyes. Then on one side, there is visual noise that's usually very salient to the human eye. On the other side, we actually display the engraving. The experience of participants is that first they just see the visual noise, and then gradually through the visual noise, they see these engravings appear. Once they see the engraving, they push a button. There's a ton load of previous research that shows that the more salient the stimulus, the faster people are at pushing. For instance, there's paradigms with houses and faces, where faces are much faster at emerging in the visual consciousness of the participants. And here you can see what one eye sees and what the other eye sees. Yeah, anyway. And the idea is that later engravings should take less time to emerge in your visual consciousness. When we look at the results, what we see is that for both the original engravings and our controlled 6 lines that were extracted from those, we see that patterns from the early time take about 2 seconds and something in the to emerge. But as we progress in time, these engravings take less and less time. So they actually are more salient to the human eye. The second is whether they're perceived as more intentional. And so we display 2 of these engravings, and we ask the participant to pick one of those as the most likely to have been produced intentionally. And what we see is that there is a very strong pattern that over time, the more recent engravings tend to be picked as more likely to be intentionally produced than the others. When we look at the markers of cultural tradition and identity, we can predict that these engraved patterns should become more memorable and easier to reproduce because they become a standardized marker of the way we do things here, but also more similar in style within archaeological site, right? There is a more clear style that emerges and more dissimilar between sites. And when we look at memorability, right, we display this, then we give a 3-second break, and then we ask the participant to reproduce them. And we can actually calculate how similar they are, either using automated measures or even asking prolific raters to rate the similarity. And then we look at whether the error in reproducing these changes over time. If the error reduces, they become easier to memorize and reproduce. And again, we see this, that over time, the patterns become easier to remember and reproduce. In terms of style, this is what we do. We present 2 destructors at the top, no, 2 targets on the top, and we say, is the pattern on the bottom more likely to belong together with the pattern on the left or on the right? Right. The idea is that as we progress in time, these patterns should be easier to associate with patterns that come from the same site, Blombos, let's say, than with patterns that come from the other side. And again, what we see here is actually that over time, the patterns become easier to recognize as coming from the same or different caves. Finally, we want to see whether these patterns become easier to discriminate within site, right? If they become more distinct so they can more easily refer to different things. And again, what we do is which of these images is similar to the target, the images on top, And you can see that the two on the right are actually the same one, right? In this case, the stimuli are coming from the same site. So we want to see whether when we have two stimuli that come from an early period, these task is more difficult than when we have two stimuli that come from a later period. And sometimes these images are rotated or not to make it a bit more challenging. And what we see here is that there is no pattern whatsoever. So, no, actually, I skipped one. This was what I wanted to show. Yes. Over time, the patterns did not become easier to discriminate within the two caves. So the idea is that we can see that these patterns, these engravings, evolved adaptively to become more salient to the human visual system, easier to recognize, easier to, as human made, easier to remember and reproduce, but also easier to recognize as belonging to other patterns from the same site, which seems to support the idea that these engravings served an aesthetic function as decoration or proto art, and that they evolved elements of styles that might signify group identity, or that people became better at carving ostrich shells compared to ochre things. However, there was no direct support for the engraving serving as the notational stimuli. So now we take the engravings as they are in the record. We tweak them a bit for experimental reasons, but we find that these engravings support or become better at certain cognitive properties than others, which provides evidence for certain uses and not others. What's missing, right? When I present you this stuff, of course, you can criticize the specific experiments, but let's take them at face value, right? What is that sort of is lacking in the inference? Well, so what is lacking is that actually we sort of associated the function with a specific cognitive property, but we haven't tested that link. Right? So what we can do is we can take a page from what you've seen in the last lecture, right, and do cumulative cultural evolution in the lab, right? Could the observed developments of the engravings be simulated within the lab? So can we actually ask people, these are modern humans, but can we ask people to do different things with these engravings and see the evolutions that we predicted? So, for instance, we have that the zero hypothesis that's very common in the field of cultural transmission is that simply by memorizing and reproducing these engravings, we might get a lot of these effects just because there's the human mind filter. So this is the first thing that we can test, right? We seed the older patterns to a transmission chain. So I show you for a second this engraving, then I take it away for 3 seconds, and then I ask you to reproduce it. Then I take what you drawn and I show it for 1 second to the next participant. I take it away for 3 seconds and I ask them to reproduce it. And of course, we have an array in the lab because there's so many ways you can draw penises with 6 lines. And then we inspect the way that they change over time using exactly the same experiments that were used on the archaeological artifacts. Okay, so here is an example. That's the early seeds. You can see that as people reproduce them, they become more and more regular and have some interesting changes. And the second also has some seemingly directed patterns. So what we can see is that in general, as the drawings were transmitted across generations, they became increasingly regular, organized, and symmetrical, despite participants trying to copy them accurately. And when they drew penises, we removed those links from the chain. Right? And those changes are argued to reflect general cognitive biases because we haven't asked them to do anything with these drawings, right? It's just reproducing them. That's the way that human perception and memory works. These were the previous results, right? More salient, memorable, reproducible, and expressing of style and human intent. When we run the same experiments on the new lab cultivated engravings, what we find, though, is that actually only intentionality matches. So we see that intentionality of later links in the chain becomes higher, but everything else is either flat or goes in a different direction than the archaeological findings. So what we can infer from this is that we're not just seeing the product, or likely the product of human perception and memory per se, but that these engravings might actually be used for something. So some of the patterns can be driven by the human cognitive system as such, but actually we need to more explicitly test these cultural practices. And so this is a register report. How lucky for you that I just introduced what a register report is. And what we try to do is we try to generate the three settings that correspond to the three hypotheses: decoration, marking of group identity, and denotational communication. And what we find, or not what we find, what we do is that we ask people to decorate a surface, or actually, I'm actually going to show it here, right? We ask participants to reproduce and transmit patterns used to decorate a surface, right? We tell them that we are interested in the aesthetic properties of these engravings. We ask people to reproduce these, to pick one of these patterns, one of these four patterns on top, and then reproduce it below on a stone to make it look nice. What they reproduce then goes to substitute the pattern for the next generation. In condition 2, where we want to look at group identity, we have the first has to draw on a pattern, and then the second one is shown two engravings, one produced by somebody who's in their group and one produced by somebody who's not in their group. And what is their group? Well, it's something that we define, right? And we ask them to identify which has been produced by somebody in their group. And we have the sender and the guesser playing together a bunch of time so that they can develop ways of doing their thing. And then once they've played a bunch of times together, the receiver becomes the sender for the next generation. In condition 3, when we want people to use these engravings to communicate distinct reference, what we do is we actually have 4 possible contents that need to be communicated. We highlight one of them and we ask the sender to pick one of the patterns above to communicate that specific concept. And then the patterns disappear again, and they have to reproduce the pattern. The receiver gets the sign and the 4 possible contents, and they need to associate. And again, they get points according to whether they do it correctly. And then Once they've done it a bunch of time, the previous receiver becomes the sender for the next generation. So we see that over time, these patterns, again, develop, perhaps in different ways. It's hard to generalize just by looking. And what we want to see is whether when we run all of these newly produced engravings through the same experiments, we can replicate the kind of patterns that we put forward as hypotheses in our previous papers. So that if it's decoration, we should really see an increase in saliency and in intentionality. If it's group identity, we should see saliency, intentionality, memorability, and style. If it's denotational communication, saliency, intentionality, memorability, and discriminability. The data is in. I've only briefly looked at them. It doesn't look like we were much on top of what's actually going on in the engravings. But this is the beauty of register reports. They've already accepted the paper. They have to accept whatever findings come out, right? Yes. So this kind of approach is now being generalized to a wide variety of different archaeological findings. For instance, in a lot of these Cantabrian figurative art that I was talking to you about, there's some things that participant archaeologists have been puzzling over for a few decades now. For instance, why are these animals always or most often depicted from the side and not from other perspectives? Or why in specific periods you cannot see it very clearly, but we see that instead of the full figure of the animal, we start seeing abbreviation, only the back and the top of the head. And we usually see several of these signs side by side. And so we can actually start seeing what are the cognitive properties of different ways of representing these animals, right? And start corroborating the hypothesis that the archaeologists have pushed forward with some more concrete evidence from modern humans. But actually, at least in this case, we shouldn't be drastically different in our perceptual and memory system compared to humans from 15 to 20,000 years ago. But I'm not going to go through that because there's just not the time. Yes. And so just to wrap that up, what we can say is that cultural transmission and evolution, as you've seen it through the last few weeks and today, shape the way we think. We can study it in many different ways. And actually, by learning about how cultural transmission and cultural evolution works, we can actually throw light to something that might have happened. Well, I was going to say hundreds of thousands of years ago, but I think the only solid results we can have are on 100,000 years ago, which I think is still kind of cool. Yes, that's it. I think unless you have questions, we can wrap it up, and then you'll get an email from me about signing up for the supervision. Do you have questions? Have you been to Modayor, the Mother Earth exhibit at Mosgard? Go, because it's very beautiful. There's also one of my PhD students who are doing this kind of work on pottery, abstract patterns on pottery produced between 9 and 6,000 years ago in Denmark, where, well, I don't really know yet where we're going with that in terms, but there is this big mystery where basically 9,000 years ago, a lot of the population in Denmark was suddenly of Middle Eastern origins, where farmers were spreading out through Europe, and the farming culture sort of replaced the hunting foraging population that was here. And they brought with them pottery drawings, pottery, decorated pottery. As the climate changed, and over a few thousand years, it decreased of 3 degrees, a lot of the cultivations that they brought with them sort of started producing less and less harvest, which meant that the population that had grown very drastically um, started having a big crisis. There was not enough food for everybody. And one of the cultural potential responses to this that happened was that there was an explosion in the production of pottery, and the patterns that decorate them started standardizing across the whole of Denmark, which at that time was not a given, right? And they also started making rituals, or at least some sort of ceremonies, in which these pottery was brought in large quantities and then either smashed or burned. And so we have these sites with thousands of fragments of beautiful burned pottery. And probably there were also leftovers of alcohol. So they were probably getting drunk at the point. And again, that's another of the cases where there's a lot of archaeological speculation, and that cognitive scientists can help starting to throw some light. This is really not something that's going to give you a job, right? But not everything is about getting a job. It's actually also the joy of discovery and figuring out things. So with that, I think I'm done for today.